The morning Genevieve married Harlan Osgood, the church smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and her father held her arm too tightly all the way down the aisle. Not from sentiment, she understood later, but from the particular guilt of a man delivering his daughter to a solution. She was 23. Harlan was 31. The arrangement had been discussed between their fathers over 2 evenings of brandy and ledger books, in the study of a house that would belong to creditors within the year if something wasn't done. Genevieve had been told about it, the way one is told about a change in weather. Her father had sat across from her at the breakfast table, set down his cup, and said, "Mr. Osgood has expressed an interest in formalizing things between you and his son." As if she and Harlan had been circling each other for months. As if there had been a courtship to formalize. They had met at a dinner party the previous autumn. She remembered a tall man with good posture and very little to say. She had not argued. That was the thing she would turn over in her mind for years afterward. Not with regret, exactly, but with a kind of anthropological curiosity about the woman she had been at 23, the one who had simply nodded and asked what the date would be. The wedding was in April 1907. The reception was held at Aldermore, the Osgood estate in upstate New York, which was everything Genevieve's family home was not, stone and solid, and unapologetic in its permanence. She walked through its rooms that first evening as Mrs. Osgood and tried to locate herself in them. The ceilings were high. The portraits were of people she didn't know. The housekeeper, Mrs. Yates, showed her which rooms were which, and Genevieve listened carefully, because she had already understood that this was the kind of house where you were expected to learn its rules rather than make your own. Harlan was not cruel to her. She would say that always, clearly and without qualification, because it mattered and because cruelty would have been simpler to name. What he was instead was indifferent. A word that sounds mild until you live inside it. He spoke to her at dinner about the estate's accounts, about the tenant's repairs, about what the solicitor had said. He never asked her opinion, but he was not rude about it. He simply did not think to ask, the way a man doesn't think to consult the furniture. He kissed her cheek on Sundays. He was unfailingly polite. In the first months, she told herself it was only that they didn't know each other yet. That warmth required time, the way bread required heat. She was patient. She read in the evenings while he worked. She learned the names of the tenants on the Osgood land. The Burkes, the Finleys, the Ashworths at the eastern edge of the property. And she remembered their children's ages and their chronic difficulties with the north fence, and which families had lost a crop the previous summer. She walked out to them sometimes with jars of preserved fruit from the kitchen that Mrs. Yates looked at sideways. She was not unhappy, precisely. She had not expected happiness. She had expected something like partnership, and she adjusted herself carefully to expect less. What she had not expected, what she found she could not adjust herself to accept, was the evening she stood in the hallway outside Harlan's study and heard him speaking through the half-open door. His friend Prescott was visiting. She had come to ask if they wanted tea brought up. Married her to settle the Whitmore debt, Harlan was saying. He said it the way one states a fact, without lowering his voice. Good family, but not much to her. Quiet as a church mouse. I don't suppose she'll ever be a burden, but I wouldn't call her an asset either. Prescott said something she couldn't make out. Oh, well enough, Harlan said. She manages the household without complaint. That's all I needed, really. She stood in the hallway for a moment. The brass tray in her hands felt very heavy. Then she turned and went back downstairs and told Mrs. Yates they wouldn't need tea after all. She did not cry. She noted this about herself with some interest. That she stood in the kitchen while the kettle came to boil and felt something settle in her chest like a stone placed very deliberately at the bottom of a well. Not grief, not rage. Something quieter and more permanent than either. She had been married 4 months. She still had 30 years to live. The arithmetic of it was clarifying. She did not confront Harlan. She had thought about it. She was not without temper. But she understood that a confrontation would require him to take her seriously. And she had just heard, in his own voice, that he did not. Arguing with a man who thought he had already assessed you accurately was a performance with no audience. She had no interest in performing. Instead, she decided to know everything. This was not a dramatic resolution. It looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. Like a young woman quietly filling her days. She asked the estate manager, Mr. Finch, to walk her through the accounts each month. She sat with the tenants when their children were sick and learned which doctors in town would come out this far for which families. She corresponded with the land agent about the eastern acreage that Harlan had been meaning to get to for 2 years and hadn't. She spoke with the solicitor about the terms of the estate's trust, And when he looked at her with the expression men reserved for women who asked about money, she looked back at him until he answered. Harlan noticed none of this. Or if he did, he attributed it to the harmless industry of a woman with time on her hands. In the spring of their second year, there was a fire in the Burke family's barn. Genevieve arrived before anyone had thought to send for help from the estate, with the Osgood wagon and 2 farmhands she'd already dispatched. The Burkes lost the barn but not the horses. Patrick Burke shook her hand afterward, and looked at her the way no one at Aldermore had looked at her before, like someone he would remember. She began to know things. She knew which tenant families were 3 seasons away from real trouble, and which of them had sons working the mills in Utica who sent money home. She knew that the north fence problem was actually a drainage problem, and that fixing the fence first would cost twice as much. She wrote Harlan a letter about it, a careful, specific letter, 3 paragraphs, with the cost estimates from 2 contractors, and left it on his desk. He didn't respond. 2 months later, the drainage project was mentioned in passing as something he'd been considering. She folded this away. By the 3rd year, she had become something she couldn't have named in advance. Not content. She was still lonely in ways she'd stopped trying to catalog. But competent, with a competence so woven into the daily operation of Aldermore that it had become invisible, which was exactly what Harlan intended, and exactly what she had allowed. Then, in September of 1909, her father wrote her a letter. He was not well, he said. He was writing things down while he still could. He had enclosed a letter for Harlan, which she was to give him directly. He asked her to keep her copy close. He died in October, before she could see him again. Harlan attended the funeral and was appropriately somber. He shook the right hands. He said all the correct things. 3 weeks after the funeral, he repeated something he had said to Prescott 2 years before, though in a different room, about the Whitmore situation being a satisfactory resolution. He had said it to a different man, someone from the county board, and he said it at a dinner party while Genevieve was 6 feet away discussing the Ashworth children's schooling with the man's wife. She heard it across the table. She heard it clearly, including the chuckle that followed. She set down her wine glass. She did not make a scene. She turned back to Mrs. Ashworth and asked whether young Thomas had gotten on better with his arithmetic since September, because she remembered Mrs. Ashworth mentioning it had been difficult for him. And Mrs. Ashworth said yes, actually, much better, and looked at her with a warmth that Genevieve held on to carefully on the drive home, like a lamp against the dark. That night she sat at her writing desk for a long time. The house was quiet. The grounds were going silver gray in the November moonlight. She read her father's letter again, the one she had been keeping. He had written it in late August, when he must have known. His handwriting was even, deliberate, careful in the way that men's handwriting gets when they are saying final things. He told her he was sorry for the marriage, in the plain terms that men of his generation used for apologies. Oblique and underlit but unmistakable. He told her she was more capable than anyone in that house would ever know, and that he had understood this too late to be useful, and that he was sorry for that too. She folded the letter and placed it in the bottom drawer, beneath her correspondence. She wrote 3 letters that night. One to the Aldermore solicitor, one to a woman she had gone to school with, who had moved to Philadelphia and had married a man with a practice there, and one to Mr. Finch, the estate manager, asking a series of specific questions about the transition of certain household responsibilities. She told no one she was leaving. This was important to her, and she thought about it clearly. She was not leaving in anger. She was not leaving in despair. She was leaving because she had spent 3 years becoming profoundly useful to a man who had told his friends, twice, in mixed company, that she was adequate at best. And she had decided that her usefulness belonged to her, and not to Aldermore, and that she intended to take it with her. She left in February 1910 on a Tuesday morning, while Harlan was in town with Prescott and Mr. Finch. She left a letter on the breakfast table, brief and without recrimination, explaining that she would be staying in Philadelphia with her friend Agnes Fairwood until the legal matters were arranged. She asked him to have her trunks sent to the Fairwood address. She left nothing behind that she hadn't meant to leave behind. With the exception of 4 years of quiet competence and every habit of accommodation she had ever learned in that house. The station was cold. She bought her ticket and sat on the platform bench and watched the steam from the engine disperse into the February air, and felt something she did not immediately recognize, because she had not felt it in so long, as the specific, physical sensation of breathing fully. Harlan did not come after her. She had known he wouldn't. He was not the kind of man who chased. He was the kind of man who waited for things to return to normal, confident that normal was always waiting just behind the inconvenience. What he found instead, in the weeks and months that followed, was that normal had apparently moved out on a Tuesday morning and taken the Tuesday train to Philadelphia. The first thing that failed was the Ashworth tenancy. Genevieve had been managing a delicate situation there for over a year. Dr. Ashworth's youngest son had taken ill. The family was behind on their seasonal rent, and Genevieve had negotiated an arrangement with Mr. Finch that deferred part of the payment until spring, in exchange for the Ashworth eldest taking on repairs to the north outbuilding. It was a sensible arrangement that existed only in a series of letters between Genevieve and Mr. Finch, none of which had been formally entered into the estate ledger, because Harlan had never been interested in the details. When the deferred payment came due, and neither the estate nor the Ashworths seemed to understand what had been agreed, and the Ashworths were informed that they owed the full balance, Patrick Burke came to the house on behalf of his neighbors to explain the situation. Harlan listened to him with the expression of a man confronting evidence that something had been happening in his house without his knowledge, which was in fact exactly what was happening. Burke had never spoken directly to Harlan before. He had always spoken to Mrs. Osgood. Mrs. Osgood arranged it, Burke said, plainly. Harlan said he would look into it. He looked into it for 2 weeks. He found 12 other arrangements like it. Small, specific, reasonable negotiations that had kept the tenant relationships functional and the seasonal accounts from tipping into arrears. Not a single one of them had gone through him. Every one of them bore Genevieve's handwriting somewhere in the correspondence. He also found the contractor estimates in the left-hand drawer of her desk. The ones about the drainage. The ones he had mentally credited to his own eventual initiative. The second thing that failed was the Aldermore account with Hartwell and Sons in town. Genevieve had been the one who maintained the relationship with the Hartwells. Not through Harlan's business dealings, which were handled by the solicitor, but through the kind of small, consistent courtesies that kept a family's credit good in a town of 4,000 people. Attending the right events, remembering the right names, sending condolences when old Mr. Hartwell's wife died in December. When Harlan appeared at Hartwell and Sons that spring to negotiate an extension on a line of credit, young Mr. Hartwell was polite but measurably cooler than Harlan had expected. He asked, at some point in the conversation, after Mrs. Osgood. Harlan said she was away. "Please give her my regards," young Hartwell said, and the meeting concluded with terms that were technically acceptable and noticeably less favorable than the Osgoods had historically received. By summer, Harlan had begun to understand that the life he'd been living at Aldermore had been supported by a scaffolding he had never looked at closely enough to see, and that the scaffolding had walked out on a Tuesday morning in February. He was not, to his credit, a stupid man. He was simply a man who had operated on the assumption that things worked, without inquiring how. It is a common assumption. It tends to hold right up until it doesn't. He wrote to Genevieve in April. A brief letter, formal, saying that he hoped she was well and that he would be in Philadelphia for business in May, and wondered if she might meet him for lunch. She wrote back. She was well. She was quite well, actually. She was working with Agnes's husband, Dr. Fairwood, on a small charitable foundation that supported the families of men who had died in industrial accidents. Preliminary work, preliminary conversations, but interesting and more demanding than she'd anticipated. She was sorry, she was rather busy in May. She hoped he was keeping well. He was not particularly keeping well. He went to Philadelphia anyway, without telling her he was coming, which was a mistake in the way that most of Harlan's mistakes were mistakes. Not from malice, but from a deep, habitual certainty that the world arranged itself around his schedule. He saw her from across the street, outside the offices, where the foundation was beginning to take shape. She was speaking with a man he didn't know, older, silver-haired, some kind of attorney or benefactor by the look of him, and she was laughing at something the man had said. Not the laugh he had heard at dinner parties, the careful one. The other kind. The kind that meant she had actually found something funny. He stood on the sidewalk across the street for a moment that felt longer than it was. He had told Prescott she was quiet as a church mouse, and she had been in his house, in his rooms, in his version of what her life was. And he had taken the silence for vacancy rather than restraint, and the patience for passivity rather than waiting. And now she was laughing across the street in Philadelphia, and he was standing on the sidewalk, feeling the particular chill of a man who has mistaken the absence of someone's full self for the totality of who they were. He did not approach her. He went to his meeting. He came home to Aldermore and sat in his study for a long time. The accounts were on his desk. The estate was not failing, nothing so dramatic, but it required more of him than it had, and he was aware, constantly, of how much of what he was doing for the first time. He had not known until recently that the Finley boys' apprenticeship in Albany had been supported by a quiet arrangement with a family in town that Genevieve had cultivated. He had not known that the letter of reference that had gotten the Burke daughter her position at the Utica school had been written on Aldermore stationery in his wife's hand, with his name at the bottom, which she had asked him, once, whether she could use, and he had said yes, of course, whatever you need, without asking what for. He had said yes to a great deal, it turned out, without asking what for. In October 1910, he asked his solicitor to contact Mrs. Osgood's attorney. She had retained one, a capable woman associated firm in Philadelphia, to open discussions, not divorce proceedings specifically. He said he wished to discuss the terms of the situation, which was the way he said things when he was not yet ready to name what he wanted clearly. What he wanted, though he was not yet able to say it simply, was for her to come home. What she needed, though she said it clearly and in writing, were three things: a formal acknowledgement of the household management she had performed, entered into the estate record, her father's books and papers which remained in the Aldermore library, and a genuine conversation, not by letter, not through solicitors, about what kind of marriage, if any, was possible between people who had been strangers for 3 years under the same roof. He agreed to all three. The third one took him the longest. They met in November, in Philadelphia, at the Fairwood house, because she had not agreed to meet at Aldermore, and he had not pushed. Agnes Fairwood made herself tactfully absent. They sat in the front parlor with tea that neither of them drank much of, and Harlan Osgood, who was not accustomed to being in a room where he was not the primary authority, looked at his wife, his actual wife, not the one he had described to Prescott, and tried to find words equal to this situation. He started 3 times and stopped. The 4th time he said, "I told people you were a burden. I said it more than once. I knew what I meant when I said it, and I also knew it wasn't entirely true, and I said it anyway because it was easier than admitting I hadn't been paying attention." She looked at him steadily. "You were managing Aldermore," he said. "Not helping, not keeping house, managing, and I let you do it, and then I told Prescott you added nothing, and that was..." He stopped. "That was a particular kind of dishonesty, not just about you, about myself." Outside, a cart passed on the street. The clock on the mantel counted its seconds. "Why did you leave the way you did?" he asked. "Without a scene, without saying any of this to me." "Because you weren't listening," she said. "And I had spent 3 years trying to decide whether that was something I could change or something I had to accept, and I decided it was neither. I decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in that argument. And now?" She looked at the untouched tea. "Now I'm not the same person who sat in your church in April 1907. I don't know if what I've become fits inside what you have in mind when you think about what you need at Aldermore." "I'm not asking about Aldermore," he said. Which was, she thought, possibly the most honest thing he had ever said to her. She did not go back to Aldermore that November. She went back in March, on her own terms, which she had written down in clear language that the solicitors had reviewed, and which Harlan had signed without argument. She had her own correspondence desk in the East Study. She had formal authority over the tenant accounts, in writing, which Mr. Finch received with visible relief. She had the right to continue her work with the Fairwood Foundation, which would require her in Philadelphia several times a year. The morning she returned, it was raining. Mrs. Yates met her at the door with the expression of a woman who had quietly hoped for this outcome for some time, but would not say so. The house smelled like wood smoke and something baking in the kitchen. Harlan was waiting in the entrance hall. He did not make a speech. He was not that kind of man, and she had stopped expecting him to be. He said, "I had them move your writing desk to the window. The light's better there." And that was how it began, not with speeches or declarations, but with a man who had finally bothered to find out where the light was good. What Prescott heard, at the county dinner that spring, was that Harlan Osgood had publicly credited his wife with the Ashworth resolution and the drainage project, and the Finley boys' Albany arrangement, had stood up in a room of men who knew him and said clearly that the estate's accounts were in better order than they'd been in a decade, and that most of the credit belonged to the woman they had met at the Aldermore harvest suppers, and perhaps not paid sufficient attention to. Prescott, who had sat across from Harlan on the evening of that first visit and heard the words quiet as a church mouse, found he had nothing to say in response. That, Genevieve thought when she heard about it later, was probably the right amount of justice. Not too much, not performed for her benefit, Just a man in a room saying, out loud and on the record, what he had spent 4 years declining to notice. She was 30 years old. The foundation work was expanding. In the east study, by the window where the light came in good and clear in the mornings, she was writing a report about the families she had met in her years at Aldermore. The ones who had lost barns and sons, and seasons worth of crops and still shown up, patient and particular, to the business of living. She understood something about that kind of patience now, the kind that is not waiting for rescue, the kind that is simply, quietly, refusing to become less.